Just give me a moment. There seems to be a technical glitch. I'm not able to share it right now. Just a minute. Just a minute. Okay, I guess the slides are visible to you.
Yes, ma'am.
So basically, when you talk about historical method, normally in social sciences, we deal with the spatial dimensions. Whenever we talk about societies, the study of societies, it is the space that matters. And in this particular method, we take both the temporal as well as the spatial scale. So, if you look at this method, it if you remember in the last class, I was referring to C. Wright Mills, and C. Wright Mills has reiterated again and again that whenever we talk about a particular idea, or even if you are talking about reading a particular author or a book, that needs to be located in the context. We have to be aware of the historical, the political, the cultural milieu of that particular idea, be it in terms of a social thought, be it in terms of a book, or any kind of text for that matter. So basically, in this method, we are trying to understand societies, and this is done by trying to reach out to views and people and events of the past. So, what I am trying to say is that we use the past as a context where we can, uh, posit ideas of the present in it, and it will help us in interpreting and understanding things better. So, when we talk about this particular method, it links the old with the new, and this particular method studies the meaning of past events in an attempt to interpret facts and explaining the events and their effect in the present events. So whenever you are talking about the present event, for example, when the COVID hit us, we were trying to analyze that it was something we were experiencing for the first time. So people started looking for all pandemics and epidemics that has taken place in the past, and what its trend has been, what has been the consequences, what has been the causes. So that we normally look for analysis in the past so that we can interpret the present in a better way. So basically, you are trying to look into the root of the problem. That is the basic idea of historical method. And it is not only simply compiling and producing the factual information, but also their interpretations, so that sometimes there is a particular interpretation available, but you tend to reinterpret it and have a completely new idea of it based on the present criteria. So you can have a comparison that in the past this so-called thing had happened, but these were the situations, these were the circumstances, and these particular circumstances perhaps they do not they are not they cannot be accounted for in the present context, so these things could be ruled out. So it is not that we are trying to repeat the patterns of the past, or pick up those patterns from the past to have the kind of analysis, but we can have a completely new interpretation of everything based on those past criteria. So basically what I'm trying to, again, when we go back to C. Wright Mills again, we are trying to contextualize those things by taking the help of history. So we will look into some of the definite the characteristics of this method. Mostly when we talk about historical method, it is qualitative in nature. It is considered to be a qualitative research method. It involves the careful study and analysis of data about the past events. It relies on both temporal and spatial dimensions. So you are taking into account the timeline as well as the spatial dimension. For example, I will say that, okay, I'm trying to make a comparison between, say, Odisha of the 1950s and Odisha of the present contemporary times. So here the spatial dimension might remain the same, but we are talking about different temporal periods, the 50s and the 2025. So that is how we tend to use this particular method, and it is helpful in understanding the nature and the process of change and development, as to how we are trying to trace the trajectory of change, that what course it has taken, where what are the different trends, and what are the different phases, that important landmarks that has taken place. You tend to pick those clues for understanding the nature of the problem when you have a historical kind of a method. So we always, if you remember, we always have a very narrow understanding about history, isn't it? So whenever we talk about history, for a very long period of time, I was under the idea that I normally had this idea that history was all about kings and queens who are dead now. So because that's the sense of history that we have uh, got during our school days. Because whenever you read about the Mughal period, we talk about how Akbar was, and what was his strategies, how he actually his political what his political agenda was like, what his policy was like. But today we are talking about history from below. The basic idea is to make history people centric. You know, history is something which is not just restricted to the kings and the queens. When I talk about the Mughal era, it is not about Babur or Akbar. It is about, say, how the life of the common man was like during Akbar's regime. And our history books do not talk about these things. So basically we are talking about the context, like what it would have been, what was the source of income of majority of the people who resided in Akbar's empire, or what are the costumes that they wore, or what was the food like, what was the gender relations of those times like. So basically when we are talking about a discipline like sociology, we are trying to, in this discipline, normally we have this trend of looking at the present, but here we tend to look at the social structures, the social interaction, the patterns of the past society, which doesn't exist anymore. So what I'm trying to say is that we always had a flawed idea of history, that history is about an individual, is about the most important person, that was the king or the queen of the particular kingdom. But no, we have to deal with the history that talks about the common man. It is like, looking at the social structures, looking at the institutions, looking at the interaction patterns, looking at the gender relations, looking at the household affairs, like what it was like in those times. So that is how we tend to connect the temporal with the spatial dimension, and that is how we tend to establish the relationship between sociology as a discipline and history as a discipline. So it is, it is something which is helpful. It will help you in understanding, as I told you, the process of change. So basically, when I'm trying to talk about the gender relations, I would tend to make a comparison between the gender relations of the past era and the present times. And it's not just about, thinking about the regime of some king and the queen. For example, I don't know if you have ever discussed these things with say your grandparents. you know when my grandmother was alive, I used to talk to her about how her life used to be like, and she used to tell me that they had almost 40 members in her family, and 3 times a day the meal was cooked. So just imagine what the idea, what the life of a woman in those times would have been, and what kind of gender relations they shared in those times, and what and how these things have changed throughout in the present context. So that's what I'm trying to say, that you are, it's not just that you have to read about or find the clues of this change and the different recent development from books or from the archives. The best place for historians is archives. But we tend to lose out on the people's version, the common man and the women's version of their lives, when we just depend on these archival material. So, as I told you, we always dealt with history from a particular point of view, that is about history from above, history from the dominant group, or the history of the elite, the people who ruled the life. But what about the people who were being ruled, and how the life of the ordinary, the everyday life was like? So that's the essence of capturing the idea of, or taking the help of history, when you are trying to use those historical data as a sociologist, and you tend to establish this relationship with the past. So when you talk about this particular method, this method traces the development of society or social institutions over a period of time. It may also trace the causes of change and the direction of change. As I was telling you, the idea of gender relations, or how the life of an ordinary woman was like in the 19 40s. And when you tend to make a comparison with the contemporary woman, so you tend to join the dots, like, what was the when did this change started emerging, what could be the real reason of change, say over this period of 70 or 80 decades, what would have happened. No, I can, in every decade I would tend to identify certain indicators, like, these could be the links that will provide me in looking at the direction of change, or they could give me hints about the causes. So this is how I would tend to make a historical analysis of the past and try to talk about the present, so that it would really fortify my understanding of the present society, and take a look at how the very idea of change in these social institutions and structures and patterns have taken place. Now, coming to the sources of method, as I told you, eyewitnesses, taking oral records. It is very important to lose out on these oral records, because, people who are in their 90s, the best opportunity is to 80s or 90s, their memories would be failing. But and we as a generation, we might be lacking the patience to talk to them or listen to them. As I told you in the last class, when I was discussing C. Wright Mill's sociological imagination, you remember I was talking to you about the juxtaposition between history and biography, because history always provides you a milieu, a context. So whenever I am trying to talk about myself, I have to posit everything in a historical context. That this was the context, like this was a time when these things happened, or the social structures were patterned in this particular way, and then I talk about myself. So the reason is why I'm telling you that when we talk about sources of this historical method, the most important source that we basically miss out on is the eyewitnesses of those times. Suppose you are working on gender relations, or you are working about the idea of managing a household, or how the family interaction was like. So basically it would be a very good idea to look at the change and the development, or in this very institution of family, or in this very institution of gender, the everyday life. So as I was telling you, talk to your grandmother about it, talk to your mother about it, and you as a generation, how do you experience these things? So you can examine the variations over these three generations, and then only you will be able to make an impact with your study, where there will be so much of clarity as you are joining the dots between all the three or four generations that you have come across. So that is how, as historians and as sociologists, we normally miss out on the oral records. So it's actually a very nice idea to talk to your grandparents or great grandparents who are still alive, and try to document the very things from their point of view, from what they know about the society of their times. It could be anything. It could be about in general, it could be about the economic system, or it could be about the political uh, scenario of those times. What is their, even if their idea is very narrow, or you might find that okay, maybe they were not literate enough to capture those dynamics, but still it does help, because that is the common man's point of view, and that is how things are witnessed by a common man, when the idea of media or social media did not exist at all, and the literacy rate was extremely minimal. So this is how we talk about oral records. Basically whenever there is any event, if even if you're talking about the Holocaust, what happened during Nazi's Germany, we look for these eyewitnesses who have been into these concentration camps. So see, something like COVID that has happened here, maybe 50 years down the line, you would be an eyewitness to this thing, that this pandemic, and maybe your experiences would matter for a researcher of that generation. So that could be one of the primary sources of information for this particular method. Then written documents or works of the contemporary period. So when I'm talking about a particular phase, it is very important to identify any kind of document. That document could be a novel. So perhaps I would say that, what was the idea of Odisha, like say in the 1930s, in the colonial times. So maybe, I will try to look into the writings of say Fakir Mohan Senapati, or the writers of those times, so that it can provide me a good idea. Those could be fictional, I don't deny that, but at the same time they talk about the general issues, the ethos of those times, like what was the value system of those times, what was the problem that the 1920s or 30s Odisha was entangled with. So that's the reason why any kind of written document of that period normally helps. Then another important source of history could be diaries. Uh, you might have come across Anne Frank's diary. It was one of the best seller of those times, and it was just the, what do you say, the reprint of a 13-year-old girl's diary who has been in the concentration camps. So date wise, it has just, they have, she has recorded some of the events, and maybe through the diary you get to see the 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 what the scenario of the Holocaust of those concentration camps was like. So diaries normally, whenever we are talking about any historical period, even if it doesn't belong to that particular person, you know, it helps you in building that context. It helps you in making acquaintances with the changes and development of that period. Then normally archaeological sources. Sometimes, you don't have well documented recorded history. So, in those cases, it is the archaeological sources that actually speak of those times. The sculptures or the depiction in the sculpture, they talk about those events. For example, when we talk about Odisha's uh, what do you say, trading traditions, the very episode of the Sadhaba tradition, the Sadhabapu and the Sadhabapu, their the kind of sea voyages they took up. There is hardly any documented history about that, and we normally don't find those kind of skills of surviving on the high seas in present day Odisha. So, historians sometimes wonder that if at all it was true or not, how could, but it is very much visible to us through the rituals, through the folklores, the very story, or the rituals of Kudurikuni or Topoi. We get this historical glimpses of the past. And apart from that, there are archaeological evidences, that talks about boats and this seafaring things. So where we are able to join the dots again. So that is how archaeological sources also provide you a supplement in establishing certain records from the past. Census data census data of those period, if at all it is available. Historical maps, what was the political map was like, because we are talking about certain cultural forms and certain cultural practices, say, of a particular event. And it is very important then to understand the political map of that period, of that particular territory, because mostly you will see that there is an established relationship between the political regime and the culture of those times. Was there some kind of interaction between two different territories that doesn't exist today? And that is how these cultural forms, they have, taken a very hybrid form. For example, I would say that, see, for the case of Punjab and Sikhism as a religion. it may be, some of the scholars say it has it has grown out of the interaction between Hinduism and Islam. So some kind of, so how, what the political map, the historical map of those times was like. So these are some of the primary sources of data that you take first hand information from. Secondary sources of data could be books, journals, articles. And in historical method, the excessive reliance is on secondary sources, because we normally, I normally say that who are the first hand sources of those data, of those period. Normally people who have witnessed that. So basically after a period of time they will die, you will lose out on the first hand data. So mostly what remains is the personal records, if at all it is available. And today we say that, today we don't, letters sometimes form an important source of first hand data. And scholars of the contemporary time, they always have this, what do you say, this anxiety that, just let me take this call. Okay, sorry for the interruption. So what I was trying to tell you is that, whenever we talk about this first hand in, uh, sources of data, mostly we lose out, because the most important first hand data is the people of that era who have experienced those events. Whenever I'm talking about, say, the episode of Titanic, they started having forming a group where, they started having a kind of a platform where they get to, call people who were on the ship on that particular day. And they would be exchanging their traumatic events, their fear. And that not only works for them as a platform which will ease them off, but at the same time it was a rich source of data for the researchers of those time who were trying to, study about the sinking of the Titanic. Or for example, whenever I'm talking about the Holocaust, whatever research we have done on it, that has been collected from people who have been into these concentration camps, who have survived that, or who have escaped that across the globe. They are scattered across the globe. But as the years pass by, these people will age, they will die. You will be losing out on those sources of data. So the most important source of data for us would be, you know, the secondary source. The second hand information about things that has been documented, that has been registered. So that is how historians mostly depend on the secondary sources of data. And because the primary source of data, even if it seems to be quite large, it fizzles out at one point of time. And today, researchers, they have a kind of an anxiety because we hardly exchange letters with each other. We have emails, and these emails are encrypted, and it is password protected. We don't give access to even our near and dear ones. So that letter being a source of historical method would cease at one point of time today, because the sense of privacy, the sense of exchange, it's no more available. It will not never be available in the public domain. So that is how you would lose out on an important source of data. With changing times and changing technology, that is one of the anxiety that the present day researchers, they share in today's times. So, how it has been used in sociological research? You know, look at somebody like Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte, he has, tried to register the changes that was taking place in the society during the French Revolution. And Comte was somebody who was completely, affected with the French Revolution, and he was just frustrated with the French Revolution because there was so much of chaos, so much of unruliness. So that's how, his very idea of stages of, the different kinds of societies that he's talking about, it is an outcome of that, because he has used the historical data of the French Revolution and tried to, bring it in use whenever he's talking about the passing of societies from this theological to the positive state. Then you have somebody like Herbert Spencer, who says that how with changing times societies become more and more complex, and that for that also he has cited examples from certain historical sources. The same you will see in Louis Morgan's theories, in Ferdinand Tony's theory, who is talking about the changing nature of communities, that which comes out in in terms of his idea of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, which talks about diversity. Gesellschaft, the modern context, it talks about diversity. Again, Durkheim, Durkheim's division of labor, or his elementary form of religious life. It actually talks about, gives you a comparative element of different societies, like what the division of labor was like in the primitive society. How they shared similar interests, they had similar nature, they had, the very base was, the very base of solidarity was similarity. And in the present times, it is the difference between us. We are interdepending on each other because we are different. And then that is the base of the solidarity in the contemporary times, but that was not the case in the primitive time. They stayed together because they were similar. We are staying together because we are dissimilar. So these are some of the insights that he has taken from history. Then Karl Marx' Communist Manifesto was completely based on archival material. Talk about Max Weber, who talks about Protestant ethics and spirit of capitalism. He is again not only making a comparison between different religions. Take for example Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, or Taoism for that instance, but at the same time he is trying to say how a particular religious idea was instrumental in shaping a particular mode of production. And similarly, you will find those instances in Sorokin's work as well. So, according to Radcliffe Brown, methodological historical explanations can either be deductive or inductive. I guess from your graduation time, since it's a master's program, you are aware of induction and deduction. In induction, we normally try to discover general laws by picking up individual cases. So, inductive method in sociology and social anthropology is based on field work, and it may offer historical explanations that are evidence based. The way evolutionists work, they will take up some instances from this society, and they will try to club different cases together and try to draw a general law that is applicable to that particular society. But in case of deductive logic, the way ethnologists use historical explanations, and they are very particularistic. There is a generalized law, and they will try to pick up instances that will fit into that generalized law. So now the relevance of and the importance of this method. Firstly, as I have told you earlier, this method provides insight into the past with multidimensional approach. It projects a clear picture of the past phenomena in relation to the present one. It can be helpful for the future. It is necessary to understand the historical aspect of the problem. Today, for example, I will say that, the idea of poverty. So, what was the idea of poverty like, say, 50 years ago? What is the idea of poverty today? Today researchers talk about, if you remember, if you are aware of the Human Development Index report, it talks about multidimensional poverty. It says that poverty is not just an economic it doesn't have just an economic dimension. There are different aspects to poverty. You can talk about many deprivations, be it terms of cultural deprivations, be it in terms of social capital, cultural capital, or certain skills. So poverty is actually multidimensional. So whenever you are citing the example of one historical event, or taking the example of the past researchers in some you know uh, and some during the something which has already happened, so we tend to take instances from the past, and we tend to make a comparison, and that, as I told you, it helps us in understanding the evolving nature of the problem, as well as our the evolving nature of our understanding of the problem, as to how our understanding of the same problem has changed over the period of time. And it is not only the problem that is changing its dimensions, it is our understanding also about the same problem that is changing its nature and dimension. So this method has been used by evolutionists, ethnologists, and social anthropologists. Looking at the transition period, as to how and when these methods have been used, in the 1920s, sees a break in the use of the historical method in sociology. Social scientists started deviating from the use of method to study the cultural past. So, 1920s, you see a break in the use of historical method in sociology. We started deviating from the use of this method to study cultural past. We started focusing on the present. They started critically using the approach of the cultural anthropologists like Radcliffe Brown, Malinowski, and also the historical approach used by Rank. In the 20s, Karl Mannheim was studying sociology of knowledge, used this approach as well. In 1930s, you will see R.K. Merton has used historical method in science, technology, and society to understand 17th century England. So, for a more enriching knowledge, researchers use mixed methods. You will see it in the work of Anthony Giddens, Peter Burke, Charles Tillis, and several others who have extensively used this method. Please excuse me for a moment. use of method in India, how this method has been used in India. So you will see that mostly this method has been used by Indologists. Are you aware who Indologists are? Basically, Indologists are the one who take the help of textual methods. So, for example, I believe you all are sociology students, and you might be having a paper on perspectives on Indian society, I believe. So, there you would have studied somebody like Ghure or somebody like M.N. Srinivas. So, what is the basic difference between the basic similarity as well as difference? Both M.N. Srinivas and Ghure, they have talked about caste in India. But when you talk about Ghure's idea, Ghure is one who has used Indological approach. That means he is giving you the understanding of caste which from the ancient text and scriptures that existed in India. For example, the Vedas, the way caste is represented from a bookish perspective, from the textual perspective of ancient India. And if you look at M.N. Srinivas, M.N. Srinivas is trying to, look as to how the caste practices are taking place in contemporary India. So basically, there is a book view that Ghure talks about, and there is a field view about it. So you have people like G.S. Ghure, you have Louis Dumont, you have Ketkar, you have Kapadia, Iravati Karve, who have all used historical texts to understand social reality. Later day sociologists who have also used ancient texts are Meena Das, T.N. Madan, Amit Srivasan. Some sociologists whose research are rooted in the history of ideas, not historical sources, but history of ideas. You have somebody like Radha Kamal Mukherjee, D.P. Mukherjee, D.N. Majumdar, P.C. Joshi, Yogendra Singh, and this approach is normally is called as the Lucknow school. And recent time you have historians like Ramchandra Guha, who gave actually a different dimension to historical research, which you know had a deviation from the way historians used to work. For example, Ramchandra Guha was a historian who had his doctoral thesis on Chipko movement, because that was not the kind of work that historians used to do back then in the 1970s. And he was the one who took up the issue of environmentalism and women's right, because Chipko was all about that. Being a historian, when historians were just in the process of gathering facts and giving explanation and causality for certain events, so that's a kind of a, what do you say, a breakthrough as far as historical studies were concerned. You have somebody like Gail Omveth who talks about and works on castes. He uses historical methods. Sarit Bhaumik, Hakha, who works on tribes. Sujata Patel, Jyotka, who is talking about again caste and agricultural practices. They all use this historical method. Now, the next method that I will be talking about is comparative method. You know, uh, Using historical method without having this comparative framework, it makes it actually meaningless. So there are certain similarities and differences between different units or cultural or social groups that are being studied. So when you talk about comparison, comparison is a fundamental tool for analysis. It is used for testing hypotheses. It can contribute to discovery of new hypotheses and theory building. So whenever you are comparing and you use comparison as a tool, you can compare between two different temporal periods. You can make a comparison between two societies during the same timeline or different timelines. So basically what I'm trying to say, that when normally we use a comparative method for comparison and as well as for testing a hypothesis. Maybe I will be talking to you about the details of the hypothesis, perhaps in the next class, or after the, maybe on Friday we can take it up. So Durkheim was, his work was very popular for use of comparative sociology, which is not just a branch of sociology, because it is, he says that it is not a branch of sociology but sociology itself, because sociology's prime focus for a long period of time has been to study social change, and you can only, register the very idea of change when you are making a comparison. Unless you make a comparison, it is very difficult. The comparison could be, as I told you, could be on the temporal scale, could be on the spatial scale, but comparison gives you instances on insights on the changing patterns, the changing structures, changing interactions and social institutions. Weber believed comparison did not consist in drawing parallels and analogies, but it was about exploring trajectories of social institutions. In order to understand causality, we have to compare a social phenomena variables that cannot be controlled. So, you know, mostly when you will talk about, if you remember in the first class, I was talking to you about the positivist approach, which normally deals with the quantitative methods, and experimental method being one of the important quantitative methods. And whenever we talk about research methodology, remember, research methodology would remain same both for students of natural and social sciences. The thing is that they are rooted in this positivist epistemology, and we normally tend to, stray away into anti-positivist or your constructivist approaches, because we are dealing with human beings, and I have told you the reason why we do so, and what is the reason for, the very idea of anti-positivism becoming popular after 100 years or 200 years of practicing positivism by the social scientists. So what I'm trying to say, you tell you here, is that when we talk about experiment, normally how does a scientist conduct experiment in the laboratory? In the laboratory there are certain variables which are controllable. It could be controlled by, the scientists themselves. For example, I'm trying to understand the relationship between pressure and temperature. So maybe I will try to control the temperature, try to have a different room temperature and understand the idea of pressure. But is it possible in social sciences? Can you control any of the variables when you are doing a field work? Maybe not. It is very difficult. And that is the reason why Weber says that since we are not in a position to control, the some of the variables, it is difficult to understand causality, and that's the reason why we have to compare a social phenomena which cannot be controlled, because in your when you are in your field, you are not even aware of the variables that is affecting your subjects or your object of inquiry. I may not be completely aware. There is something called, you might have heard of independent variable, dependent variable, and there is something called EV, extraneous variable, a variable which is affecting your object of inquiry, but as a researcher you are not aware of it, because everything is not visible to us through naked eyes. You need to, it's not visible, these things are never they remain invisible. We need to understand the dynamics and the forces. That's the, the major challenge of social sciences. You are not in a position to control, and there could be certain extraneous variables which would be affecting your subject and object of inquiry without your own knowledge. So that is the reason why we need to compare between different phenomena, between different societies, so that we can identify some of the causalities by that comparison. So, according to Durkheim, a given effect has always a single corresponding cause. Suicide can be caused by multiple factors, but each factor produces only a particular type of suicide. So there can be many causes for suicide, but every factor would produce a particular form of suicide. So that is how you will try to identify it by comparing that particular type of suicide that takes happens in different types of societies. So you can say, this is the cause in this particular society. That cause could be repeated, but you did not find the same cause here because these were the circumstances. So that is how you can make an analysis of the present scenario in the present text. So Niels believed that social phenomena is caused by plural and convergent causations. And Durkheim was somebody who rejected the idea that an effect could have more than one cause. Because he was somebody who believed that it could be caused by one factor. The kind of causality be tested on varied cases, and that's how it could become a law. You tend to test it, you tend to compare between societies, you identify a particular cause, and then you say that okay, this is like the norm, and this kind of law can be generalized for different societies, and you tend to look for a social law. So Durkheim cites the examples that the tendency to suicide varies directly with education. It is impossible to understand their correlation because you will have different causes in different societies, and you cannot have a quantitatively pinpoint at a particular causality the way scientists do when they tend to control one variable, try to see its results, you know try to fluctuate it and see different results. That is not possible in social sciences. So that's the reason why we go for this method. Education, especially elementary branched knowledge, reaches only superficial regions of consciousness. It may not affect self preservation instincts. So, I might be having a big degree, but it is not necessary that it will affect my consciousness in a robust way. So, it has, the very idea of keeping myself safe, the very instinct of self preservation, it might not, root from your degrees. So education might not have any role at all when you compare between the rates of suicide. You might see the other way rather, that educated people are, they overthink, or they are more prone to suicide. So here it is very difficult to have those kind of what you say conclusions. So we come to ask if both facts are consequences of identical conditions. So the common cause could be weakening of religious traditions or affecting both. Okay, education, you see that okay, both educated and non-educated people, they commit suicide. So could it be that religion is a reason? So what are the common indicators that will lead to this kind of an understanding? So Durkheim says that societies do not create organizations entirely. It receives them from previous societies. These organizations experience change over time, and these changes can be studied with comparison. Durkheim provided a sociological explanation to suicide by using comparative method, comparative statistics for countries and categories of people. Maybe we can take a break, 10 to 12 minutes, and we can gather again before I take up this new idea. Welcome back. So, we will continue with the methods that was given by John J. Mill. Uh, Basically, he talks about different methods when we are trying to arrive at a conclusion. One is method of agreement. I have one example. It says all had taken pizza and they all fell ill. That is the method of agreement. Method of difference, all had fallen ill after having pizza except one who had not taken. That's the method of difference. The joint method, all had different types of food, all fell ill. The son had not taken pizza and burger. The daughter had not taken burger but pizza. But burger cannot be reason of illness as second son had not taken burger but was also ill. So this is how you tend to use the method of the joint method. Method of concomitant variation. Pizza made A somewhat sick. Two pizzas made B sick. Five pizzas made C critically sick. Variation refers to the severity of illness. Now the method of residue. We have range of factors causing range of events. All factors except X is the cause. Inference X is the cause of the remaining effect. Well, talking about Radcliffe Brown, who has also used this comparative method, he has divided Australian. If you look at his study, he has divided Australian societies in terms of totems, different totems, and every totem represents one reason of that society. So Brown analyzed certain tales of the Australian societies. These tales interpret resemblance and difference of animal species in terms of social relationships. Natural species are placed in pairs of opposites. For example, eagle and crow. Next step is to discover diverse forms of opposition. The third, the relationship of opposition is a combination of agreement and disagreement. He gave a historical explanation to certain problems. So basically, he is relying on the method that we discussed above, and he has tried to implement it in the Australian society, trying to give a historical analysis, a comparative analysis, as well as the historical analysis to them. In totemism, there was a special association of social groups with a natural species. The nature and function of social relationships and social structures are based on what has been called opposition. This problem of opposition can be used as a mode of integration. So here comparative method passes from particular to general and from general to more general. That is like talking about a general law of the society. Then again, you have Weber's comparative method, which is again inseparable from his idea of rationality. I think you all are aware of Weberian ideas of rationalization process. So he uses it in the context of trans-historical generalization. He attempts to understand reason behind the emergence of capitalism in Europe. What were the different nuances? Why did a particular society could do so well economically as far as capitalism is concerned, while the others did not? So by making a comparison between Western society and the major civilizations, he was able to come to the conclusion that how religious ideas can be instrumental in developing economic practices, which was quite antithetical to Karl Marx, who had said that religion is the opium of the masses, and uh, perhaps religion is something which doesn't facilitate growth. But Weber comes up with a study that how certain religious ideas could actually shape up uh, the very spirit of capitalism. So this was all about comparative, historical and comparative method. Uh, I will. So we still have time. So I will take up feminist method as well. Just give me a moment as I share the slides with you. Are you able to see the slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I wanted to complete the blog today, but we are still running out of time. Okay. I'll try my best to complete it today. So basically, what is this feminist method? You might be having a paper on sociology of gender. So the when we talk about research methodology in general, we tend to see that normally we see things from a man's point of view. you know uh, when till the 1970s there was this idea that it is men who work, because the definition was of work was something that brings you an exchange value, where you are having some monetary benefits, you are working in lieu of some monetary pecuniary benefits. So normally, GDP, when you calculate the GDP of a nation, it doesn't take into consideration the unpaid invisible work that women do. So no, you had this towards equality report that was published in, I think, in 1975 by this team, and they could see that it clearly shows all the data, the census report, all different databases that you deal with. It clearly showed that women do not work. So that was something which was very puzzling, uh, because who is the first one to get up in your house? Maybe it's your mother or your wife, the woman of the family. She is the one, because he has to look into the household chores, he has to look into the food that you would be taking, you'd be eating. And everywhere you go, you see women working, washing clothes, fetching water, working in the fields. And at the end of the day, all these documents, these reports, they say that it is men who contribute, it is men who work. So that was something which was you know not what I say, digestible, because everywhere you see these women working. And I see it in my everyday life. Wherever I go, I see it. Whoever I ask, I see it in, my common sense says so. But the documents, the reports, the databases, they say something else. So how is it possible that women do not work when your entire, work schedule gets disturbed if your mother or your wife falls ill? Isn't it? You know, you just live one day. Your mother is ill. She has not been able to prepare your breakfast, your tiffin box, so that you can carry it to your schools and colleges. Your dress has not been ironed. There is nobody, the dishes have not been done. You have these this is lying in your sink, the house is not clean, and then you go out to a restaurant, you pay for your breakfast, you pay for ironing your clothes, you pay for your lunch, you pay for your dinner, you pay for all those you know tasks that my mother used to do for me, and today I am paying for that. And I could realize that on a single day I have spent say 200 to 300 rupees, just because my mother has not been able to deliver those services to me. So what I'm trying to say, that it brings before you this idea that the kind of labor that she has been doing, it's not only unpaid, it's invisible, and it has not been recognized by anybody, not even by myself. Because at the end of the day I would say, what do you do? Kon korcho ki tame? Tame ghare bascho. As a housewife, you just sit at home. You are not contributing anything. So that was something which was affecting this entire feminist scholarship, that you know it's not only in your everyday activity, but epistemologically, when you are looking into your methodology also, there is a gendered way of studying societies and studying this discipline. So slowly we were, after the 70s, we were hit with this gendered aspect of researches being taken up, studies being done, and it came as a challenge to this positivist epistemology, because positivism doesn't recognize this gendered element. So basically, if you look at the broad themes in feminist methodology, it takes, as a rebuttal to the research methods as positivist and value neutral, because positivism, which has always talked about, objectivity, value neutrality, but that idea of value neutrality has somehow affected the very idea of seeing things in a positive light, see things from a neutral perspective. So there are debates about method that should be used to study society, and these debates was about studying society as a lived experience. Because when I was discussing with you the positivist and the anti-positivist position in the previous class, if you remember, I told you that positivism was somehow, collecting data, the data that appeared to be headless, as C. Wright Mills have pointed out. Headless because, you know, it really doesn't concern me who talks about it. As I had given you that example of the kind of survey, Times of India comes up with. Do you think India would win in the present India-Pakistan uh, war? And the other day, the result would come that okay, 65% said yes, and rest 35% said no. But I really do not have a clue as to who these 65% are, and who these 35% people are who really believe this, and what is the reason why they believe this and why they do not believe it. That it doesn't make sense. These kind of quantitative positivist standpoints, they do not make sense. So basically, we talk about we miss out on the lived experience. If you remember, I had told you that we were so very obsessed with the very idea of gaining legitimacy for our discipline in making it a science, that we forgot the very fact that natural scientists, they're dealing with inanimate objects, and we are dealing with human beings who are constituted in terms of certain experiences, certain feelings, and certain emotions, certain intentions. There are certain motives behind everything. We do not just do it out of, some habit or some practice, or there is no, we do not just go by instinct every time. We always We are rational beings who have a clear cut plan and chalked out a plan for everything. So what I'm trying to tell you is that you know every society had certain dominant values. And if you remember, I was talking to you about the relationship between sociology and common sense. And common sense somehow is laced with these dominant values, and we tend to, you know, look at or study society from the point of view of the dominant values. So, when it comes to rationality, freedom from religious dogma, ideas of progress, linkages with progress and capitalism, we again see it from a very positivist position as well as from the dominant norms of the society. We found the Industrial Revolution very progressive, but we were not really, what I say, we are not really looking into the being critical about it, that later age researchers could, carry out. So what I'm trying to say that sociologists till the 1970s did not focus on gender. So the way you look at the society before the 70s was from the perspective of a man, and the kind of gender it was assumed to be quite natural, that okay, women are supposed to do these things, and cooking and taking care of the household, it is something which comes very natural to them. They need not be paid for it, and it doesn't need to be included in your GDP. So basically we come up with this assumption that women do not work, they sit idle, they don't contribute anything to the economy. But if you see, I was just giving you the example of that one day when your mom fell ill, and you were not in a position to take her free service, and you had to buy every little service that she provided to you from the market. Per day you had to spend a quite a big amount of money. Now imagine if we as a family or your father had to pay a salary to your mom for carrying out these services. And remember, your mom doesn't take a day off. She is never on a holiday. There is no Sunday for her. There is no off day for her. Whether she is ill, whether she is not feeling well, you still have to eat. She will have to be in the kitchen and cook for you. So just imagine of the scenario where your father has to pay her a salary for every little thing. She is cooking, so maybe I'll have to pay 5,000 for the cook, or I have to pay this much amount for make washing the dishes, for washing the clothes, for taking care of the kids, for taking care of the sick and the elderly, to the school, or for teaching them, for driving you to the nearby marketplace, whatever. If you tend to calculate each of the tasks he is doing, uh, for which he is not being paid, maybe your father would be, he would be exhausting all his salary. Suppose he is earning 1 lakh per month, he would realize that, oh my god, I have to pay some 60,000 to my wife, because the kind of dedication and the kind of love again that she laces with her services, it is priceless. I know everything is priceless, and it is a very demeaning thing to calculate the love and the affection of your mother. But if you when you say that women do not work, and we tend to make an estimate of her work, we could see that 60 out of that 1 lakh that he is earning, maybe 60 or 70,000 of that money would go to your mother as a salary. So in that case, it will not be possible for your dad to run the family, run the household with that amount of money. So what he would do, he would ask for more money or more salary to his employer. The employer could be the capitalist, it could be the state, it could be anything. So that's the reason why, basically Marxist feminists, they said that capitalism survives. It is not only capitalism but the state. They also survive on the unpaid labor that is being provided by these women, the so-called housewives who do not do any job, who sit idle in their homes. So the moment they will ask you the salary, every price will get doubled. So capitalism, actually it is not your father or not just the family, it is the capitalistic system of the entire world that thrives on this unpaid labor of the woman, because they do not have to pay her a salary, so that is unpaid, so they can manage to pay less to your father and run the economy, and on the other hand they can amass large amounts of profit. And at the end of the day, all the reports and document would say that women do not contribute to the economy. So that is how studies have been conducted, because things have been done from a man's perspective, where it has been assumed that it is quite natural and obvious for the woman to do the household work, because it is very, you tend to compare that, that love is priceless, it's a duty, that's how why mothers are born for. But just think of her as a human being who is trying to participate in the labor force. So this kind of a discourse is political rather than being a neutral approach. Am I clear? So when I
Yes, ma'am.
say, yeah, thank you. When I say that you are trying to, create a dichotomy between academic and political approaches, because that's how we have always treated it to be. Like, academics has to be kept away from political approaches. Politics and academics, they don't go well. But, that doesn't work here, because whenever we are talking about rights, which is again a political kind of a approach, which is a kind which belongs to the realm of activism, that needs to be reflected in academics as well, because it depends on how and from whose perspective you are looking at things. Because if you remember, I told you in the first class when we were discussing positivism that observing or studying something is not just seeing things. When you see something, you have to be aware that you are observing from whose point of view you are observing. You are observing in it from the actor's point of view, from your point of view. If at all you are observing from the actor's point of view, who that actor is, that actor is a man or a woman, that actor is from the higher caste or the lower caste, that actor is from the marginalized group or is from the privileged group. I have to make these categories as to who that actor is. So that is how the debates about feminist research range from epistemology to the methods used. We are trying to trace how feminist methodology emerged over the period of time. So, as I told you earlier, that positivism and value neutrality has always been quite aversive to this kind of approach. The ontological as well as the epistemological position of sociology has always been positivist, because we were trying hard to call ourselves a scientific discipline, and we did not take into account the human experience for a very long period of time. And even when we started taking that human experience, we thought that the average human was the man. We forgot that 50% of the population constituted by women who can also be that average human being. So that's the reason the positivists work with the aim of formulating universal scientific laws. Social structure was seen as comparable to the natural world, and similarly, methods used by natural scientists would be applicable in the study of the society. So, There was this scholar called Rene Descartes who happened to be this 17th century scholar who focused on the division and the dichotomy between mind and women, sorry, mind and body. And it was believed that the mind pertains to the man, and woman has always been equated with the body because you know there are certain bodily responsibilities. Woman is able to bear a child, she is to able to feed a child, which is which reduces her entire identity to being a body, the way she is perceived as a sexualized object. That idea doesn't is not associated with a man, because man seems to be the creator. He is the creative mind, he is the reason. So we tend to have that kind of a dichotomy. We have similar other dichotomies like nature versus culture. Nature pertains to woman and culture pertains to man. Private versus public. The private, which constitutes your family, your household, your religion, that is the realm that is dominated by women. And public, that you know that comprises of governance, laws, economy, the political system. It is something that belongs to the realm of the masculine things. So, this dichotomy that Descartes talked about in the 17th century, the feminist researchers rejected this dichotomy and said that research questions and knowledge generated, they were androcentric in nature. Harding and Smith have noted that the Western categories of reason and rationality as opposed to emotions. The public versus private. The public private dichotomy is central to feminism and Western political thought. So, when you talk in terms of simple words, the private denotes those activities that take place within the domestic sphere, and the public comprises of activities related to business, law, politics, and governance. This concept assumes importance in the context of gender roles, because this is how you define the gender roles, that you know the idea of domestic chores, that belongs to the woman, the idea of going to office, that belongs to the man. We have demarcated these gender roles. So the opposition between the public and the private has always taken to be quite natural and obvious, that it it is the woman who can only take care of the kids. But that doesn't mean the same today. You have feminist scholars like Kamala Bhasin who says that it doesn't require a womb. It requires a womb to bear a child, but it doesn't require a womb to cook or to clean the do the dishes or to care for the child or the elderly. Both a man and a woman can do it. It doesn't require a womb for a man for not being able to do those activities, and the womb doesn't be a barrier that normally women have been abstained from doing certain activities that they take up today. So the distinction sets a hierarchy between the public and the private. So normally we believe that the public is hierarchically superior to the private. So the task that has been taken up by men, it is superior to the task that is done by women. Mostly when you look at this dichotomy, it has been criticized on two grounds. First is exclusion of Don't exclude. Don't. That is not your water. Don't take that. Chetu, don't take that. Take it from your own bottle. Okay. When I'm talking about the exclusion of women from public life owing to their emphasized presence in the private sphere, she is the one who is juggling between the private and the public. So we believe, it's better that she be relegated to the private sphere. It's something which is not her cup of tea. So the floodlight on political nature of the private has never been there. That the private space can be equally political. It can have certain kind of power dynamics. You might have heard of this saying in Hindi. It says that जेठानी का बेटा सबसे मोटा. What does this mean? Jethani is like the elder bohu of the family. So she is in charge of control of the kitchen and the household resources and food. So basically, that hints at this idea of intra household inequality. There is this concept called intra household inequality because we have always considered inequality to be something that exists between households. That okay, there is an inequality in terms of income, there is an inequality in terms of asset distribution, and that's why you have certain families who are in a disadvantageous position. But you might be aware of what do you say, uh, families where there is a certain resource crunch for certain members of the family. Normally in North India, they say that married women do not take non-veg, or the way food is distributed between the boy and the girl in a family. Suppose you have chicken curry or mutton curry, you will see that most of the families, the boys have a greatest share. And when I used to interact with my friends from the north, they would say that we have this tradition that after marriage, women do not take non-veg. So what happens after marriage? The digestive system gets weaker. That is not the case. There are certain practices which have been devised in the name of religion, in the name of tradition, and which becomes the base of this intra household inequality. And you will not just see it in terms of food resources, you will see it in terms of education also. Parents giving allowing their sons to go for technical education like engineering and medical, because that they need to make a investment on the boy. And when it comes to the girl, they would say choose a general line where you can just do something without much resources being spent on you. So basically what I'm trying to say is that there is a idea of power play taking place within the household. We have always believed that where does power exist? Now, power is something which is seen in the state. There is a political nature of power. So, households also have certain power dynamics, and the kind of political approach that is given to them, it is made invisible. We believe that they are completely apolitical. They are rendered apolitical. It's something which we do not actually take into account. So, this absolute separation has been rejected by feminists, and they have linked the idea of sexual division of labor that has created notions of unpaid labor for women within family, helping in the sustenance of capitalism and public domain. So, when I'm talking about this dichotomy that is associated with the public and masculinity and the private with femininity, and we believe that power dynamics is always there in the public space and the private realm is apolitical, there lies a problem. As I told you, the case of intra household inequality, which has a gender dynamics. It doesn't only have a gender dynamics. You will see these kind of dynamics when among sons also. Suppose a son who is earning and suppose a son who is not doing economically well or who is not good in studies. Parents without knowing, or they might have certain kind of a discriminatory behavior, the way, the kind of comfort situation, because I don't blame them. What I'm trying to say that since there is a resource crunch, they will try to divert those resources to the one who is doing well, because they have this feeling that they need this kind of a support system to continue doing better the way they have been doing. So there is a kind of an intra household inequality that is seen within the private realm, within families. So you will see that this separation between the public and the private is normally seen as the patriarchal face of liberalism. Political liberals like Locke have dwelled on the idea of non-political aspect of power in the domain of family structure between men and women. Some feminists consider private sphere to be equal with the public. The criticism of family planning policies as coercive for obtaining demographic goals on the part of the state is a case in the point, because they believe that there is a hierarchy. It is not about men and women only, since the public sphere or the public realm is more important than the private realm. So they believe that anything can be imposed on the private. So, for example, when the state is trying to control the population, it tends to, push something in terms of one child norm, or something that is, uh, you know, that is put, that is imposed on the women. So, on behalf of the state, it has to achieve certain demographic goals. So in turn, what it does, it tries to give certain targets to the families, which is a part of the private realm. Okay, so that is how there is a continued hierarchy between the public and the private. So that's the case in the point that I'm trying to prove. So the focus on the control of state over women's reproductive processes and their bodies, that has always been there. I'll give you an example here. In many countries, it was scientifically first approved that conducting, you know, implementing family planning, what do you say, strategies, it was a safer option on men, because when you have these birth control devices, in terms of pills, in terms of certain tools, they tend to have a side effect on women, because it affects their hormones to a great extent. So that's the reason why they started with targeting men for these family planning affair. Because every state had to control it, they had certain demographic goals. But this strategy failed miserably in case of men, because mostly men had this idea of their masculinities being affected because of these family planning devices that that was implemented on them. So when it failed, the easier target was the women, because it is easy to manage women. They are more docile than men. They cannot become violent as the men would become. So it was not for scientific reason, but it was for being able to manage this danger, that they started targeting women's bodies. you know you use certain, tend to experiment certain devices or pills for birth control on women, or say a state which has sparse population, which is completely underpopulated. They would encourage and try to give all kinds of put all kinds of demographic goals onto the women bodies, so that they can produce more babies. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that every family planning goal that is implemented by the state, it is done with this purpose of maintaining a particular demographic goal for its future, and it is done via the women's bodies, which are a part of the private realm, and they do not take their consent, or they do not look into the pros and cons of it, as to how the woman would be like, or how these private spheres would function after that. Because there is a dominance, there is a hierarchy between the public and the private, and normally you will see that the public is more important or superior to the private. That mostly you will see in these societies. Okay, I guess we can stop here, and I can take up the next debate, that is nature versus culture, in tomorrow's class. If you have any doubt till now, you can just tell me. Any doubts, any queries, any clarifications?
Ma'am, can we get these PDFs, the PPTs?
These PPTs are basically, there is nothing new I have added. It is from the same material that is being given to you. I will try to talk
Yes,
to your organizers. Let's see, but it will not help you, because don't use it as a shortcut. I would expect each one of you to go through the material. Those two books of research
ma'am.
methodology. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. We will go through the material, but this can be used as a crutch not for the last minute revision or overload. That's it.
Let me see. I'll just talk to the organizers. Let me see.
Ma'am, we have a group. If you don't mind, you can share.
Sorry, sorry.
We have a group, ma'am. If you don't mind, you can share in that group.
I'll see. I'll see. I'll let you know. I'll let you know. I'll first talk to the organizers and let you know. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.